Hi, everybody. You're listening to Comics and History, episode number 121, part 2, Spotlight on the Spectre and the Silver Age continued. And welcome to the show. I am your host, Brian J. Rygate, and class is back in session after a recess of about 2 weeks, continuing our look at DC's The Spectre and the Silver Age. So in part 1 of this episode, I spoke about the Spectre's 3-issue tryout, which came in Showcase in 1966, and now I'm looking at the other Spectre stories of note from the Silver Age. And comicbookdb.com is a great guide for those of you who are trying to keep your chronologies of different characters and events straight. I'm referring to it right now, just making sure that I get everything in order and I'm not missing anything. And so I actually need to start by talking about a 2-part JLA JSA team-up story which appeared in August and September of 1966 in Justice League of America, issues 46 and 47. Crisis Between Earth 1 and Earth 2 / The Bridge Between Earths. This 2-parter actually came out before issue number 1 of the Spectre's solo series. Actually, this was sandwiched in between issues 61 and 64. So clearly there were those who were hoping that the Spectre would have a successful showcase. And so this 2-parter actually helped give some more insight into the character's power set. There are a couple of really neat nicknames given to the Spectre during this time. One was the Discarnate Detective, and the other was the Disembodied Detective. I think those are two really neat nicknames for the character, and they were especially helpful for this 2-parter, which I'm going to talk about, because we actually don't see Jim Corrigan in this story. We do see the Spectre. I spoke about this 2-part story in greater detail probably 2 or 3 years ago at this point. I was looking at all of those JLA JSA crossovers. In this crossover story, we're introduced to the Antimatter Man, who is putting Earths 1 and 2 on a collision course. And so it's up to the Spectre to stretch himself out and position himself in the space between Earths 1 and 2, while the other heroes handle the Antimatter Man and send him back to his evil realm. I guess what's confusing about this story is that we're not quite sure which Earth Jim Corrigan is from. Again, in those 3 showcase issues, there wasn't any specific reference to Earth 2. But here we get a couple of hints. The first one, I'd say, is actually pretty important. It's in the roll call, which always featured in the first page of any of these JLA JSA team-ups. And the Spectre's name is included in the JSA roll call. And then at the end of this 2-parter, when the JSA goes back to Earth 2, the Spectre appears amongst his colleagues. So that this story pretty well establishes that the Spectre is indeed an Earth 2 character. Again, also serves to show the incredible power of the Spectre, that he's able to grow to gargantuan size, and he's able to keep entire planets that are normally separated by different vibrational frequencies separate. So you could say that the Spectre really got a 5-issue tryout prior to the Spectre #1, which came out in November, December of 1967. The Spectre was a bi-monthly book, so that means it ran for only 10 issues. However, because each issue is being produced every other month, it felt more like a 2-year run. And issue #1, by the same creative team as in the showcase stories, writer Gardner Fox and artist Murphy Anderson. Anderson would come back onto the art later, but as an inker this time, Gardner Fox would stick around for a little bit before departing and then coming back for an issue. I mean, certainly both of these men were quite busy with a number of different books, and I think that's why they weren't on this book consistently. And I mean, today you could say, well, if this creative team had stayed on the book, thanks to the internet, social media, having discussions with fellow comics fans at local comic book shops, knowing that an A-level creative team was on this book would have made the book last much longer in 10 issues. But I mean, none of that existed back in the 60s. So outside of word of mouth, amongst readers on the streets or in the playground, I get the impression that the Spectre Volume 1 was not a title which was a really high priority for DC, and those who worked in the executive offices knew that Mr. Fox and Mr. Anderson couldn't be on this book month in and month out. So this will be more of a tryout book, a book for up-and-coming writers and artists. Now, that's not to say that the other creative minds who worked on this title were not bad. Certainly not by any stretch. In fact, very young Neil Adams would pencil a number of issues for the Spectre Volume 1, and he would even write issues 4 and 5 of the Spectre. And just as an aside, when looking at Mr. Adams' Silver Age Batman work, which was more inking than penciling, you get the sense that editorial policy when it came to rendering Batman visually was very strict. There was this idea of a house style which had to be maintained. And so certainly Carmine Infantino was one of the, if not the primary Batman artists of the Silver Age. And so when you look at different Batman books, it really looks like the artists were told, okay, make Batman look this way. And so when you look at a Silver Age Batman that's penciled or inked by Mr. Adams, it doesn't really look like a Neil Adams Batman. However, when it came to his work on the Spectre, even in 1967, 1968, you could see Mr. Adams' signature style was there. I think that Mr. Adams drew an awesome looking Spectre, just with his sense of realism in art. And it's a shame that Mr. Adams didn't stay longer on this book, but then if he did, we would most likely have that much less Neil Adams Batman work to enjoy. Issue #3 was written by Mike Friedrich, who I mentioned in part 1 wrote a letter to DC and said that he couldn't see the Spectre being a sustainable character in his own book. And certainly that mindset carries through in this issue here. Very interesting reading the letters to the editor with regards to issue number 3 by Friedrich. A couple of letter writers said that they felt that Friedrich thought that he was writing an issue of Wildcat, co-starring the Spectre or featuring the Spectre as a special guest. And indeed, when you read that issue, it does read more like a Wildcat comic. The Spectre doesn't even show up until the halfway mark or just the halfway point. And it's a story about Wildcat feeling his age, realizing that he's not so quick or lithe or agile as he used to be, and so he's struggling now to fight crime. And so it's up to Jim Corrigan and the Spectre to lift Wildcat's spirits and make Ted Grant realize that while he may have lost a step, he can still contribute, both as a costume crime fighter as well as a teacher. And so for all the flack that Mr. Friedrich got for writing this particular issue, it's a story which actually holds a very important place in DC Comics history, because over the years it's been explained that Wildcat, while he continued his costume career, he also opened a boxing gym, and while he did train everyday civilians, he also was a very important teacher and early mentor to such heroes as Batman and the second Black Canary. So this is a really important issue of the Spectre, because for my money, this is the first time we see Ted Grant not just as Wildcat, but also as an instructor. And of course, the appearance of Wildcat in this issue establishes that the Spectre is a resident of Earth 2, and that this is an Earth 2 title. Now, I do need to talk about a couple of issues of The Brave and the Bold. And actually, the first one, issue number 72, appeared in the summer of 1967, so before the Spectre number 1. And it's a story that is written by Bob Haney and penciled by Carmine Infantino. The story is titled Phantom Flash, Cosmic Traitor. This is one of those Brave and the Bold stories that was put out just before the title shifted over to being a Batman feature, which featured a rotating cast of guest heroes in the title. And this story, in the first page, establishes that the story takes place on Earth 2. Barry Allen has, for whatever reason, come over to Earth 2, had to wrap up a case on the central city of Earth 2, which is kind of interesting. I'm wondering if Mr. Haney forgot that when Barry traveled to Earth 2, he normally traveled to Keystone City. That was the home city for the Jay Garrick Flash. But of course, Bob Haney was someone who didn't so much care as much about continuity as he cared about just telling a good, enjoyable story. And more on that in a little bit. But in this story, a ghost pilot from World War II manages to catch Barry Allen. He manages to separate Barry's spectral form from his body, and not only that, he manages to control Barry's astral self. And so it's up to the Spectre to intervene and to take down the spectral Flash and restore him to his body. Really neat seeing Carmine Infantino render a Spectre visually. He did a pretty good job on it. As neat also seeing a team up between the Flash, Barry Allen, and the Spectre. Normally when we think of Flash Spectre team ups, we think of Jay and Jim Corrigan.